Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture covers the comparative anatomy of the forelimb and the pectoral girdle in marine mammals. So we're going to start with a quick review of the skeletal anatomy in humans, and then we're going to take a look at some pictures of the forelimb and pectoral girdle in different marine mammals. And from there, we'll basically pull out some trends from morphometrics, which is the quantitative analysis of form. And then from there, we'll move on and actually look at the forelimbs of the pinnipeds, the cetaceans, and finally the sirenians in a little bit more detail. So let's get started. A quick review of the upper limb of the arm shows that basically humans, when we think about our arm, we have a humerus, which is the long bone, the upper arm where your biceps are, and then of course below your elbow you have your radius and your ulna, and then you have various bones of your hand. A quick look here, when I actually pull up, I have a human limb, upper limb here, and what I'd like you guys to notice is that our bones are long and slender and round and built for not necessarily supporting a lot of weight, but certainly for lots of mobility. And of course, if you look here, one of the things I'd also like you to notice is that our hands probably comprise somewhere around 20 to 25% of the total length, but not more than 50% of the total length. So our hands, which also retain a lot of mobility, of course you know this, you can move your fingers, are not huge in our upper limb. Okay, so with that, let's take a look at some marine mammal forelimbs. So if we take a look at some pictures here, I have two different cetaceans. We have a fin whale, which is a mystaceti, and a sperm whale, which is an odontoceti. And then I also put up an elephant seal. And what you might already just generically get is that the hands tend to be larger, and the limb bones tend to be a little bit shorter, the long ones. The humerus is very short in some cases, and you might even notice there's kind of a stout, flattened appearance to some of these. So just from basically taking a look at these forelimbs, let's see if we can pull out some trends. Okay, as I noted, the manus, or the hand, is going to be enlarged. In some cases, it can make up to 50% or more of the total length of that limb. And in this picture here, this is actually a sperm whale upper limb. And what you might notice is there's a red tracing around the manus, or the hand. And that's where you actually would see the flipper. So when you look at the body outline, that red tracing represents the actual flipper. And so you notice that the flipper includes the hand and of course some very short radius and ulna, and the humerus and of course the scapula, which is part of the pectoral girdle, is up inside the body outline. Okay, along with this, we see that the bones, of course, are flat. And we're going to see that in a lot of cases, especially when we get one functional unit like a flipper that doesn't maintain a lot of rotational ability or a lot of movability. So we're going to start to see that it makes a lot of sense to make basically your upper limb look like a paddle. And as part of that, you need to flatten out those bones. And along with that, because the bones are no longer moving against each other, we don't necessarily need to see a lot of rotational ability, and so the consequences, a lot of the bones start to fuse in order to maintain strength at the function of mobility. And of course, because we've got so many different taxa that we're looking at, we're going to see some evidence of convergent evolution again, where if they're doing the same things or they need to do the same things, they're going to start assuming some of the same shapes. That's especially true among the cetaceans and the sirenians, which are both fully aquatic and have both modified their front limbs to be one basically continuous flipper. All right, so let's get started with the pinnipeds. We'll go ahead and start there. All right, a quick look at this picture shows the front limbs of the pinnipeds and, of course, the pectoral girdle, and you might notice some of the things that I'm about to talk about here. Again, with those front fins or flippers, we notice that the humerus is completely contained in the body outline. In other words, the flipper really is just from here down. So this represents what you would see as a seal flipper, not this. It's not the whole thing. It's just from here, and the humerus is up inside of the body outline. Of course, we see that there is a scapula, but no clavicle. In fact, among all marine mammals, they do not have a clavicle. Clavicles are usually known as collarbones. We have one, the apes have one, but most of the carnivora from which the pinnipeds evolved from do not. And so we still see a lack of a clavicle, but we see a pretty large scapula there. And of course, the bones have become more stout-like, and that includes the humerus, the radius, and the ulna. And then, again, something else you might notice is that the joints still appear to be movable. In other words, they haven't become so squished together that they can't move. And that is absolutely true. We have mobility at the shoulder joint, at the elbow joint, and at the wrist joint for all the pinnipeds. So again, they can still move their shoulder, they can still move their elbow, and they can still move their wrist, which is needed for mobility on both land and in the water. So again, we're going to take a look at the structure-function relationship. When we take a look at pinnipeds, we notice that the otariids and the phocids use their limbs differently, and that's true also for the front limbs. In the otariids, they use their front limbs for swimming. So think of it almost like birds flapping. They kind of do this motion in the water to move themselves. And so they are predominantly a front limb swimmer. And on land, however, the otariids use both their front and their hind limbs to walk, whereas the phocids do not use their front limbs for swimming, they use their hind limbs for swimming. So right there, you might already expect to see that the otariids are going to have maybe a little bit bigger of a front limb or have some different structures because of the way they use their front limb in the water. If you need to do this motion all of the time, you're going to need some pretty big muscles and bones to actually keep doing that. So we're going to actually see if there's any differences between the otariids and the phocids that we can see because of their structure-function relationship. And indeed, we can. So in this drawing right here that I've put up, I have an otariid front limb and the scapula, and a phocid front limb and the scapula. And the first thing that I want you guys to note is that the scapula in the otariid is much bigger than in the phocid. A larger scapula means more surface area for muscle attachments, which is consistent with the idea that they use their front limbs a lot more in the water to move their bodies. Also, something you might notice when you look down at the phalanges or the fingers is that the phocids, their fingers end in almost like points, like claws, and the otariids have more blunt fingers at the end. And this is also reflective. A lot of phocids live on ice, and they need those claws to actually gain traction in the ice, and so they actually use those claws to kind of help them move around on land and on ice. So two big differences here, an enlarged scapula for the otariid versus the phocid, and that the phocids retain claws because most of them live, or many of them live on ice or need to use those claws to kind of help gain some traction on the land. So those are two big differences between the otariids and the phocids in terms of front limbs. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and look at the cetaceans. Now, you might already notice a huge difference in the cetaceans. The cetaceans, of course, you have one functional unit, a flipper. And really, because you have one functional unit, you're going to see a lot of anatomical trends to maintain that functional unit. First and foremost, they really only have one movable joint, and that's at the shoulder. That's between the humerus and the scapula. And how do they move them? With the exception of the humpback whale, which maintains more mobility than most, really you're just going to use them like an airplane wing, to help you go up or down in the water column and maybe move a little bit of side to side, but not a lot of motion. So What do you need? You need stability. And as a result, we notice that the bones are going to be flat, they're going to be squat, and in many cases, they're going to be fused. So flattened bones that basically sit in a nice flipper, we notice that they're fused in many cases, and some of the whales exhibit what's called hyperphalangy, which means they have more finger bones than normal on account of having longer flippers. So those are some of the outcomes that we see from cetacean as a result of their form or their function, being able to be fully aquatic, swimming in the water, but not necessarily needing the dexterity that like humans retain in their fingers, and rather just kind of needing their front limbs to help swim and maintain position. So that brings us to the sirenians. Now, at first glance, the sirenians always show a lot of similarities to the cetaceans. Again, despite the fact that they are in a completely different evolutionary group and they evolved completely independently of the cetaceans. So what do we notice from these pictures that are the same? Well, first we notice that just like cetacean, they use basically a fluke or a hind paddle to move, and that their front limbs are not, or their forelimbs are not going to be used for propulsion. They're going to be used for steering. So you might think, well, then that means that their bony structure is going to be just like the cetaceans. But if you actually, and I do encourage you to do this, go online on the internet and just Google any type of sirenian motion, manatee swimming, and you watch them swim around, you will notice that their front limbs actually maintain a lot of mobility. Despite the fact that their paddles are kind of doing this and that suggests that they maintain a lot of mobility at their joints, maybe to help them position, move this way and that way, similar to the way that you would if you were in the water. To change directions, you help with your hands. You make paddles and you say, okay, this way, that way, etc. They actually maintain a lot of that mobility. And it turns out that we actually have a sirenian forelimb that we can take a look at. So I'm going to go ahead and start with the scapula. We see a very large, broad scapula, which is consistent with a lot of marine mammals. Again, nice places for muscle attachments there. We have a short and stout humerus. Again, this is very consistent with marine mammals. That humerus, again, is going to be up inside of the body outline, so you don't actually see the outline of the humerus like you do on a human, or like on a cat, a dog, or a wolf, for example, but it's still round. Again, that's telling you that it's not in the actual front flipper, which is flat. And then we get to the lower part of the upper limb. This is going to be your ulna. This is going to be your radius. And then you have your carpals, your metacarpals, and your phalanges. Now notice, if you kind of look at this picture here, this view, notice the bones are quite flat. They're not round like they were for humans. And that tells you that this is going to be what fits in the paddle area or that front flipper. Now, I'm going to take you over here to this dock cam so we can take a look at the elbow joint. All right, this is the elbow joint. Now, my question is there mobility here or not? If we take a look at the form really carefully, it strongly suggests there is still mobility, and of course, there's quite a bit, which tells us that the mobility of the forelimb is at the elbow joint, most of the mobility, and it helps actually position and move that forelimb back and forth. So this is unlike the cetaceans, where the elbow joint is fused and does not have very much rotation, if any at all. And that basically concludes our comparative anatomy look with the marine mammals. I'll see you next time.